The Arizona Restaurant Association is behind a lot of my misery these days. Many people are suffering at the hands of Arizona restaurant owners. According to the president of the ARA, it would take an extra $250,000 per restaurant to start paying all their workers the minimum wage, which means they are currently paying their employees a lot less than the minimum wage. According to basic math, Arizona restaurant owners stand to make around $115 million a year from Prop 138, which the ARA is pushing. Prop 138 is something the Arizona Restaurant Association pushed through the legislature to buff their profit margins. It's a little complex, but to put it as simply as possible, tipped workers currently get paid $3 below the minimum wage. Prop 138 would increase that amount. Anyway, the Arizona Restaurant Association is doing something else that irritates me. They are claiming that 90% of tipped workers support the current tipping structure.
That 90% of tipped workers support the current tipping structure that we have here in Arizona.
And we think it's the right direction for our industry, and 90% of tipped workers across the country support this kind of status quo or this type of tipping structure.
90% of servers support this. There's a Carnegie Mellon study, Ted, that shows and demonstrates that they do support it.
The source for this is an article on restaurantbusiness.com who cites Lloyd Quarter, a professor at Carnegie Mellon University. That literally has nothing to do with the study. It was done by his company, Corcom. Weird how they didn't mention that. Now, you may be expecting a video to debunk this number, but no. I've debunked that number elsewhere, linked to the video in the description. But to briefly get into the study, it's a hodgepodge of 8 surveys across 8 different states, none of which is Arizona. These surveys were conducted as a publicity stunt to fight the elimination of the tip credit. Participants in these surveys were hand-selected by restaurant owners for their likelihood to give preferred answers. In other words, the survey was conducted by restaurant owners going to whatever workers they trusted the most and giving them the survey. A very flawed methodology that would give any rational person just cause to discard the results of this survey. Except for one small issue with these surveys, they're not notable. They seem to be extremely racist. As in, you heard my description of how the surveys were distributed. Employees the restaurant owners trusted. The demographic data for participants in these studies showed an extreme bias towards the inclusion of white people, to the exclusion of almost everyone else. In the Ohio survey, it was so white that the next highest demographic group after Caucasians was prefers not to say. In the Illinois survey, the numbers were so bad that they just straight out hit the delete key. Imagine putting out survey results when you know they are so flawed that you have to delete data from the final report. Shameful. So that's who Steve Shukri, the president of the Arizona Restaurant Association, keeps citing. Now, I'd prefer he stop citing that 90% number because it doesn't include any Arizona participants. I'd implore him to stop using it because the methodology was so sloppy and flawed as to be racist. But I think the most effective tool I have to stop him from using it again would be fear. Fear of what, you ask? I want Steve Shukri and any other Arizona Restaurant Association lackey to be absolutely petrified that if they use the 90% number, somebody will come back and reply, that 90% number doesn't represent Arizona workers. But more importantly, Steve, how can you claim to speak for 90% of Arizona workers when you don't even speak for 9% of Arizona restaurants? Yeah, the Arizona Restaurant Association only represents 9% of Arizona restaurants. Feels a little misnamed, doesn't it? Maybe they should call themselves like the Arizona Association of Groups who are restaurants but don't really represent the entirety of the group. I'll get into the math on that number shortly, but I think that's enough to stop having to hear that lie of a number, 90%. I spent my entire summer researching Corcom and their misleading surveys. You can't imagine how irritating it is to have their work bandied about like it has some credibility. So I'm glad to have dealt with it again. The threat of having that one-liner candidated into your face as a response should be enough to silence it. But let's talk about the math now. How did I get that number, the Arizona Restaurant Association representing only about 9% of Arizona restaurants? Well, I went looking through their tax returns. Since they are a nonprofit, they are posted online for anyone to see. Reviewing the most recent year, 2022, I find exactly what they got paid in membership fees. About $196,000. Which, that's not a lot of money. That's really low for an organization that should be drawing most of their revenue from membership fees. I mean, their 2004 tax forms show them getting $209,000 a year. That's right, they've more or less stagnated since 2004. Boy, the guy in charge since 2002 must have been doing a terrible job to have screwed up that bed. Anyway, back on topic, the next thing we need to do to figure out the 9% number is that we need to know the membership cost in 2022. It's $295 for the first restaurant, and any additional locations cost $150. Okay, so dividing the membership fees received in 2022 by the $150 cost of each additional location should land me on the highest possible number of restaurants the Arizona Restaurant Association represented in 2022, barring however many freebies they gave away. Doing this gets us 1,308 restaurants, and dividing that by the number of restaurants in Arizona in 2022 gets us 11.25%. 11.25% is the maximum number of restaurants that the Arizona Restaurant Association represented of all total Arizona restaurants in 2022. That doesn't sound impressive at all, does it? In fact, it sounds like we're dealing with a bunch of liars who claim to represent all restaurants in Arizona. But I'm just getting warmed up. I can do better than a maximum number. I can get you much closer to what I think is the real number. So let's do that. Yes, that sounds good. That sounds fun. I hope the Arizona Restaurant Association is happy to have made me so angry by bringing up the 90% number non-stop. Does this feel worth it? You guys happy to have done this? Alright, originally I only divided by the each additional location fee for membership, which isn't correct. I mean, that doesn't make sense at all, every restaurant being an additional location. You need at least one first location, and presumably a lot more. All of Arizona isn't one original restaurant and a bunch of franchise locations. This isn't Demolition Man. And since that fee, $290, is nearly double the additional location fee, that'll probably drop our 11.25 number by quite a bit. So let's take a stab at what that might be. Let's say that 75% of the members of the Arizona Restaurant Association are additional location fees, and just 25% are first location fees. Running that mixture through the previous formula nets us around 9%, which is what I've said since the beginning is their number. But I've left out one important part. Vendor members. Vendor members are people who sell to restaurants, but crucially don't have any restaurant locations. They are also members of the Arizona Restaurant Association, mainly for marketing and networking purposes. So while their membership fees would be counted with actual restaurants, it wouldn't actually increase the number of restaurants the Arizona Restaurant Association represents. So how many vendor members does the Arizona Restaurant Association have, and how much do they contribute in restaurant fees? Well, I don't really have a good way to count that. I can look at their board, which is more than half vendor members, and see that it's probably not a small number, but I still really can't get a good bead on that number. What I can do is look at that 9% number and say that, assuming only 25% of the members are first location members and the rest are additional location members, then I can use the vendor members as sort of a margin of error. As in, I think this is a correct mix of first and additional locations, but if the first location fees number I chose was too high, then it's most certainly offset by membership fees of vendor members who have no restaurant locations. In other words, the Arizona Restaurant Association only represents 9% of Arizona restaurants. Barring, of course, some insane number of freebie members. Oh, but I'm not done kicking yet. My boots aren't even scuffed yet. I got plenty to drag the ARA on these tax forms. Starting with the president, Steve Shukri. He makes, not respectively, $292,000 a year at the Arizona Restaurant Association. The eagle-eyed among you may have noticed that this is almost $100,000 more than they take in membership fees. Yeah, I guess the board looked at his performance and thought, great job, Steve. Shame he hasn't focused on, growing the organization. Steve Shukri's been the president of the ARA since 2002. You'd think they'd be doing better under such brilliant leadership. Again, they are taking less in membership fees in 2022 than they did in 2004. But hold on, that $292,000 a year is actually worse than you think, because it's around a quarter of all revenues the ARA took in 2022. Yeah, for every dollar the ARA took in, 1/4 went to Steve. Not profit, not revenue after expenses. No, every dollar that walked in the door at the ARA, 23.5% walked out with Steve. And to make it go from worse to catastrophic, that number is more than the ARA has contributed to the PAC running the pro-Prop 138 campaign. Yeah, in a truly baffling move, the ARA has contributed more to Steve's pocket than they have to the Prop 138 campaign, which makes no sense to me. I get why they are trying to pass Prop 138. It gives them more money. North of $100 million a year more money. But apparently they can't muster up enough money to fund a campaign to get all that money. All of this while, their CEO is getting a crazy amount of money for a nonprofit that can't even get to representing 10% of the restaurants they claim to represent. It is truly a case of messed up priorities, and this is coming from someone who wants them to lose. I've wondered a lot about the Prop 138 campaign. I've wondered why it's such a broke affair. Like, I've looked at their website, and it's just such a sloppy mess. It looks like a beginner's website template where they've just added some text and stock photos. The social media campaign has barely interactions. Their signs and buttons are stock photos. It's just sad all around. To bring up Corcom, the survey company that Steve's been cribbing that 90% number from, that has vexed me so much, there's a reason Arizona wasn't included in the survey results. Corcom works more or less for Berman & Company, a big DC lobbying firm. They are the proverbial big gun when it comes to lobbying. If you want Corcom, you hire Berman & Company. If you want to win, you hire them. They are not cheap. If you are a poor little restaurant organization that can barely afford to run a political campaign, you can't afford them. The best you can hope for is to cite their blog posts, which is what Steve's been doing. But to understand the levels of support the Arizona Restaurant Association has from frontline workers, and exactly how broke they are, let's go back to the beginning of Prop 138. Back in March 2023, the Arizona Restaurant Association marched their fake Save Our Tips organization in front of the Commerce Committee hearing. The people in the Save Our Tips shirts were meant to pretend to be frontline waiters and waitresses so they could present a more persuasive case for Prop 138. Directly affect real waiters and waitresses, but not these people. Now, I've mocked, insulted, and judged the Arizona Restaurant Association for this incident. I'm not dredging this up for those reasons. I'm bringing it up because I want to make a point about the resources of the campaign and the Arizona Restaurant Association as a whole. I'm not going to judge them for doing it. I'm going to judge them for how they did it. The three people who spoke were a head server, an assistant manager, and the vice president of Snooze, an AM eatery. The last person was also on the board of directors of the Arizona Restaurant Association. And it was super easy to track them down. I mean, they're all on LinkedIn. They made zero effort to even cover it up, or even choose someone else. I've wondered why they didn't just hire a few less scrupulous workers, a big bag of cash to testify, or even hire a ringer or two who couldn't even be tracked down. Instead, they went with these screw-ups. Now, being as values neutral as possible, does that sound like the kind of stunt that is pulled by a group that has the resources of the entire state restaurant industry behind it? Or does it sound like a desperate attempt by the State Restaurant Association that operates under the handicaps of representing less than 10% of the restaurants in the state, as well as heavily overpaying its CEO? A state restaurant association whose budget is stretched so thin that it struggles to keep the lights on. Because personally, it sounds like number 2 to me. Pun definitely intended. To bring this all the way around to the beginning of the video, Steve Shukri. He cited a study that claimed that 90% of tipped workers support having their wages cut. If tipped workers actually supported this in the numbers that Steve and this study claim, then wouldn't it stand to reason that they could muster a better supporter than who they did bring? Wouldn't the ARA be able to send forward a better representative than a member of the ARA board masquerading as a waitress to make his case? Because that sends the message that no, workers don't actually support Prop 138. I'm History Sock, and I'll see you at the next committee meeting.